Hello, thanks for joining us today. Today we're
Okay.
joined by Mathew Baskerville, who is a senior risk and safety engineer. And today Matthew's going to discuss with us our case study and answer our case study questions. Thanks for joining us today, Mathew. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit about the role that you do?
Yep, sure. Hi, Karen. So my name is Mathew Baskerville. I'm a senior risk and safety engineer for Genesis Energies, and that is it's a fairly broad role. But I primarily write safety cases, or I'm in the development of safety cases, which are documents that oil and gas operators require in order to perform certain activities that they want to perform, because there are a lot of regulations in place that control what companies can and cannot do. So as part of my role, I need to be really on top of the industry regulations that these companies need to work under and be able to correctly interpret them and do the studies required to be able to prepare the documentation under those regulations. So as part of that, I'm also a professional workshop facilitator. And yeah, and we do some other very minor studies as well, but I'll just say primarily safety case development.
Excellent. And you work within a team of specialists across various project management teams?
Yep. So sometimes it can be as small as a team of two, where you've just got a very simple, say an addendum or an appendix to an existing safety case, and they want to make some minor adjustments to the list of activities that they're performing at a particular facility. So then two people is enough to get that done. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you can also be part of very large projects where you are working together collaboratively with all different types of disciplines, varying from dot control all the way through to project management. But on a similar level, you have your other engineering disciplines, so civil and mechanical engineering, process, structural specialists, etc. So yeah, you can get, that's probably one of the best things about the job that I do, is that as a risk engineer, you're not sort of pigeonholed as badly as some other engineering types, and you do get quite a bit of variety come through. Sometimes you do get those small jobs, and sometimes you get those that last a full year. So
Excellent. And mainly your work is on offshore platforms?
that's correct. So yeah, primarily offshore platforms, but also sometimes working on offshore vessels, not actually on them, but doing the documentation for them. Occasionally, we do drill rigs as well.
Excellent. And it's not something that you can sort of complete and put on the shelf. It's an ongoing process, isn't it?
That's correct. So safety is constantly evolving. So a safety case by law has to be updated every 5 years in full. So in part, that's what keeps us going in a way, in that every 5 years the company has to put out to tender a safety case update, which sometimes can cost $500,000 for that particular company, depending on the size of the facility. So they're not small jobs by any means. You know, to complete a safety case, you have to update a full suite of formal safety assessment documents, which means you look at fire and explosion analysis, non-flammable hazard analysis, so ship collision with platforms, dropped objects onto pipelines, among other things. We complete escape, evacuation and rescue analysis, safety critical element analysis, which looks into reliability, availability, and survivability of safety critical elements, which are things that are required to maintain safety during major accident events at those facilities.
So yeah, so it's quite critical. And with the rate of innovation and technology, it's obviously really important that you not only keep on touch of developments, but also the changing legislation as well with regards to the work that you do.
Yes, that's right. So we constantly have to stay updated with what the industry regulator, which is NOPSEMA, so the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Management Authority, Environment and Management Authority. We always just call it NOPSEMA. So we do know that there are some like unwritten rules almost. One being that nowhere in regulations is it written that any offshore vessel has to have 100% lifeboat capacity on each side of the vessel. But if you don't have it, your safety case won't get accepted. So there are some things that you can only pick up once you're in the industry in order for you to get things done. So it's not easy for someone to just start out in this role. There's lots of things to pick up along the way.
Yeah, and it obviously you learn quite a lot from the experience of your experienced professionals and your senior leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one role where all of your university study, assuming you come from a process/chemical engineering background, which most risk and safety engineers do, what you learn at university under that degree doesn't apply much directly to the role, and you have to learn 95% of what we do on the job. And in that case, or in that way, the university degree is really an entry ticket. And that's not unique to my role either. It's pretty common across the board that really the engineering degree just gets your foot in the door. And then that's really only the beginning of your learning. So I can make one quick anecdote on that. And that's, I remember my very first workshop was it was a drilling workshop, and I was scribing, and I could barely follow the conversation because of the acronyms that were being used. So it was a really sort of wow, like there's a whole new language to learn just to work in this industry. So
excellent, yeah, and that working knowledge is absolutely key. And the terminology and the jargon, like you say, it is just like learning an entirely new language and understanding what that actually means, because especially in your role it's so important to know exactly what's going on because it is so critical.
Yes, exactly. Precisely. I couldn't say it much better myself.
Excellent. So moving on to our task questions. So
Yeah.
Our first task question that we set was, what factors must you take into consideration when producing digital text documents? So when you're actually creating your reports, you know, what factors must you take into account when you're producing these text reports that are so important?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would say to anyone coming into industry is be very conscious of the degree of communication, the skills in communication that you need. I wasn't prepared myself, and I had to spend a lot of time cleaning up the way that I communicate both verbally and in writing. As a university student, and this is very common, people tend to use way too many words to say something really simple. So in industry, people want you to get to the point and not to waffle on. So being able to write concisely and sort of cleanly is very, very important and highly regarded in industry. And I would even go as far as to say that communication skills are equally, if not more important than your technical ability as an engineer, because there's no point being able to do all the studies that we do and not be able to communicate them effectively to other people. So that's certainly one thing to be aware of. And another one is actually as simple as formatting. So we're basically professional writers in a way. And a lot of people don't know how to format properly. And it's actually a really valuable skill once you get into industry. So some of our documents are hundreds of pages long. And if you're unskilled at formatting, as you add and chop and change things throughout the document, you're going to basically, if you've manually formatted all the way through, you'll destroy your formatting for the entire document. So it's a really valuable skill to be able to have automatic formatting in your document, so that if you change or add something right near the start of the document, then the rest of the document reorganizes itself without you having to go and manually update it every single time. So very underrated skill that pretty much nobody has when they come into industry and have to learn on the go. So
Yeah.
Anything else to add to that one?
I was going to say exactly what you said with like 100-page documents, just simple things like the find and replace tool.
Exactly.
Where
yes.
you can, if you've spelt one particular word or a name wrong accidentally and you've used that throughout, to actually be able to just replace every time that word
Yep.
you've used. You could have like 100 replacements done in absolutely one hit. And I think that's those sort of cheeky little tips and tricks that you learn along the way absolutely saves so much time, which is really critical as well when you're trying to get something done. You want this process to be as quick as possible. And I really like what you said about how, when we're at school and at university and college, we're always encouraged to add more and to give more detail, because that's that's seen better as a better thing. But actually, when they give it to us in a really concise way as teachers, actually that is what industry wants. So it's
exactly.
It's funny how we encourage something in education that actually, when they do leave, is needs to be completely reversed.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
On your search and replace, one of the things sometimes you pick up is that not only can you search and replace words directly, but you can also use codes in search and replace.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Shift 6, which is the arrow up, can be used to input codes. Like that arrow with P stands for carriage return, and you can replace carriage returns. Another one is if you do that arrow and C, the C stands for clipboard. So you can search and replace anything with what's in your clipboard currently, which is a really hidden, very few people know about that one, but it's extremely valuable, particularly when you need to replace superscript or subscript throughout the document. So say someone's written a document with the word CO2 in it, but they've never subscript. You can go through the entire document, search for CO2, and then replace with, say you just copy the right way onto the clipboard by doing Control C, and then you go into search replace and you put arrow C for clipboard and just hit replace, and it will replace all of them with the right version.
That's so good.
So,
really nice, quick little trick, isn't it? And like I say, it saves so much time. That's so good.
And there's hundreds of those little tips that you can.
I know you could go through so many.
You could go on about that for hours.
Brilliant. So our second task is which of the identified controls that you use are actually considered safety critical.
Yep. So I'll start right at the beginning, and this might take a couple of minutes to explain in full. So imagine you'd have a hazard identification workshop where you're looking at safety, environment, financial hazards for the company. What you then do is filter those for what are called major accident events, which are events that can result in 2 or more fatalities. And these are identified by the experts in the room based on basically their opinion and their experience in industry. So a good example is a hydrocarbon loss of containment from a pipeline or vessel would almost always be classified as having major accident event potential. So then you go on to say, well, okay, what controls are in place to both prevent and mitigate that? And you'll come up with a large list, some technical. So for example, emergency shutdown valves, blowdown valves, passive and active fire protection, among many others. And then you may also have procedures. So there are certain things there are ways that things have to be done in order for overpressure not to occur, for example, and maintenance. So you need to keep proper maintenance on certain facilities in order for the integrity to be maintained. So once you've identified all this stuff, you would then do an assessment to identify which ones are safety critical. Safety critical meaning that control must operate on demand in an emergency in order for the safety of people on that facility to be maintained. So there are two ways to differentiate. One is whether it's safety or another type of critical. So one example is a subsea isolation valve that is, say, 100 meters from an offshore facility. That valve doesn't stop the immediate impacts of the loss of containment at the facility. But what it does do is it isolates the facility from perhaps many kilometers of inventory contained within a pipeline. And what that is more effective at doing is lowering the impact from an environmental perspective. So instead of having hundreds of meters of cubed of gas and condensate leaking to the environment, you may only have 10 meters cubed leaking to the environment. So that's one example where it's not safety critical, but it is environmentally critical. And also on the other side, safety critical elements are usually your technical / hardware controls, which do not require human action. So if something requires human action, it's generally not considered safety critical because it cannot be relied upon. Because you need someone to actually act. It's not, so a technical control would be a fire and gas detector, which in itself is critical, which leads to a computer processing system, which is also safety critical. And that computer processing system may then send out actions to emergency shutdown valves to close, to blow down valves to open, amongst other things happening. So generally you'll find that things that act automatically are what you refer to as safety critical elements.
Excellent. And that's really interesting to know, actually, because the concept of, like, if humans are involved, it's not reliable, is a really interesting thing to be aware of.
Well, yeah, people are inherently unreliable. A good example is car crashes. So if we had self-driving cars, you would eliminate about 89% of accidents should they operate properly.
And it's funny how, as people, we find it very difficult to trust machines, and yet they're more reliable than we are.
Yes, usually way more reliable. especially if you have redundancy in place. So redundancy is having a parallel system, which if the first one fails, the second one will step in.
Excellent. Yeah, so good. It's really interesting to know these things, and that will apply across the board, not just obviously for these sort of very high level, high risk role situations that you deal with, but right down to the very basic health and safety in a business environment. If you've got a machine operated with a backup system, then that's obviously going to be far more reliable than somebody else doing that job.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. So our third task is, how can Mathew remain up to date with relevant legislation as part of your own professional development?
Yeah, so the most easy way is to sort of subscribe to the regulators' communications. So they will often send out notifications that things have changed. They don't actually get updated all that regularly. And to be honest, most often they won't update the whole thing. They'll put up like a little bit of extra thing. Oh, here's a new little additional thing that you got to take care of. Like a recent one was operational risk assessments, which was, it's like a little piece that's just added on and saying you got to do this as well now. But mainly you keep up to date through colleagues, because as a consultant, we're generally one peg down the tree of the information flow. So NOPSEMAs and regulators and operators tend to talk directly to each other, and operators and consultants work directly with each other. So you can sort of say regulator, operator, consultant, and we don't jump over operators. So we very rarely, if ever, talk to NOPSEMA directly. It's always through an operator that we are doing work for.
Excellent. So so you're always taking that information from, like say the colleagues and the people that you're working with and for.
Yeah. So if there's anything that we've missed that's super important, our clients will tend to be on top of that because they're the ones who are in constant communication with the regulator.
Excellent. Awesome. So in terms of our final task, we look at how you can interact effectively when implementing your safety systems to keep the risk as low as is practical, but within reasonable cost. So obviously the goal for you is to maintain those really high safety standards, but not at a cost that makes it
That's correct.
Infeasible. I don't know what's the opposite. Not feasible.
Yeah, infeasible.
Infeasible. Yeah, there we go.
Yes. So a LARP, as low as reasonably practicable.
Mm-hmm.
People think that it's really simple to understand, but it's actually not. And if you Google reverse a LARP, you'll see that there's sometimes that people try to do things backwards. I'm not going to go into reverse a LARP here, but so as low as reasonably practical means that you cannot do anything further. You cannot apply further control measures that the benefit gained is disproportionate to the investment required. So there comes a limit where you cannot do anything further within reasonable cost. So that is always comes down to the opinion of people in the company, but you have to demonstrate that to the regulator, and they have to agree with your argument that something is a LARP. So what we do is we actually run a LARP workshops where we identify risk reduction measures, which is another concept, but at the end of the day, it's like you've put everything practical in place that comes under good practice, and then people in the room that are working on this job brainstorm for anything further that could possibly be done to make safety, to make it safer, I guess. And then you have to provide justification for rejecting it. And it's often through these rejections of additional risk reduction measures that you can really paint the argument that you're trying to present to the regulator.
Yeah.
There are many examples, but it's a difficult concept for people to understand. They used to do cost-benefit analysis, but we've kind of moved a bit away from that and tend to go, there's a diagram called, it's a Yukowa risk reduction decision-making framework, which people can look up. It's under the Yukowa, which is UKOOA, which is UK regulator. And they have a flow chart which basically says if the activity that you're doing is well understood, then you can generally get away with good practice. And there's a sort of matrix where it goes to medium well understood to not understood at all. And you need to do more and more and more the less that activity is understood. So if you're doing something novel, new for the first time, then you have to put a lot more work in to demonstrate a LARP.
Right.
The majority of our stuff in oil and gas does come under good practice, well understood risks, because it's a 100-year-old industry. So most of the stuff that we're working on is actually very well understood. But new innovations come along all the time. So we do occasionally have to go into the other end of the spectrum and do lots more work.
So that's all this
Long-winded answer.
keeping you on your toes.
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent.
Hopefully that was understandable.
Yeah. And the alarp is quite an interesting, as low as reasonably possible. So, you know, I guess it comes down to that whole chicken and egg thing. When they're looking at doing something, do they do the safety analysis and decide whether they're going to make it feasible, or do they start it and then you have to demonstrate alarp?
Yeah. So that's actually exactly what I was talking about, is starting with an end in mind, and we shouldn't do that. And I'll also pick you up on the way that you said the acronym. So you said as low as reasonably possible, which is actually, no, it's not as low as possible.
Ah, is it not?
It's
Oh,
as low as reasonably practicable.
Ah, my
And
bad.
they are different. They are
Thank you
different.
for correcting me. And they, I
Yes.
guess they are, aren't they? Because it's what is possible and what is practical is
They're two different things.
two different things. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you for correcting me on that. Yeah.
We could spend the company's entire budget to make a small activity as low as risk as possible, but that's an impractical thing to do.
Yeah.
So you got to weigh up the safety with what is a practicable expenditure for the company.
Absolutely.
So what you can't do it backwards. So the way you sort of frame that is exactly what I was talking about with reversal up,
Yeah.
where you work with, this is the argument we want to have at the end. How do we frame our beginning to make our LARP argument that? No, you can't do it that way.
Can't do
You
that.
have to start with, you got to go through the process properly. So you start with hazard identification, filter for major accident events, run through all of the formal safety assessments, and then at the end, bring that all together to determine, so you've got your full picture, you know your consequence, you know your likelihood. And for anyone out there that wants to understand risk is combining consequence and likelihood. It is both of them together. And then you determine whether it is a LARP once you've gotten to that point. You should never start with, this is our LARP position, before you've even done the analysis.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's really good practice as well, isn't it? To
Yes.
do it properly every time. We've actually reached the end of our task questions. So there's another question that I'd really like to ask. And obviously, oil and gas is a changing industry, and there is a lot more to oil and gas than just the fuel that we use to fill our cars. It's used for so many other products, and it's such a big industry. If any young person, I know you mentioned earlier degrees as well, and the importance of work-based learning. What would you say would be the most important skills that a young person would need to demonstrate in order to work effectively in the industry?
Yep. The ability to constantly learn actually is, I would say, is number one. So when you get to an industry like oil and gas, you do acknowledge that you are at the tip of the iceberg, meaning that you're working in an industry that is maybe only second to the space industry for the use of cutting edge technology. So you really have to constantly keep up to date with what's going on. So you can't be someone who thinks that I've reached the end of year 12 school. That's the end of my studying. That's the end of my learning. Oil and gas is not the industry for you if you think that. You need to be willing to constantly educate yourself and be willing to, believe that it is a career and that you're doing it for the career. Another thing I'll say is that particularly these days, a lot of young people are turned off by the stigma against oil and gas, being that oil and gas isn't seen as climate friendly. But I think that you can do the most good when you actually work in that industry and advocate for certain practices. So even myself, I'm very passionate about energy transition, particularly hydrogen. So I would love to see hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen, really take off and actually overtake oil and gas. And people have to understand that just because people work in oil and gas doesn't mean that we're all against the climate. In fact, quite a lot of people in oil and gas want to see the energy transition taking place. It's just that you can't help the situation from the outside. And you can actually do a lot of good from the inside in terms of promoting your company to do more in the energy transition space, which my company, Genesis Energy, actually is doing. So we were called Genesis Oil and Gas last year, and our name has only recently changed to Genesis Energies as we look to diversify out of the oil and gas industry. Well, not out of it, but just diversify into new industries. So whether it be wind, solar, hydrogen, hydropower, etc. So you can't just, our society is 100% dependent on the oil and gas industry. I wish it was another way, but that's the reality of the situation. And you can't just scream at politicians to say, stop the industry, because the whole society would crumble if we were to do that. Pretty much everything in the room around me is here because of oil and gas. For the energy required to move things around, direct ingredients into plastics. It's no getting away from the fact that oil and gas is both essential for energy and as key ingredients into things that we manufacture.
Excellent. And I love that concept of, true empowerment and true change comes when you're both educated, but also you are actually involved in that environment so that you can do it from the inside out. Because like you say, standing on the sidelines moaning and shouting and saying this isn't fair isn't going to get you anywhere. And I think that's a really good lesson, regardless of what industry you want to go into. If you want to see real change, you need to educate yourself, get that role, and get inside that industry to make those changes yourself. And I think, that's absolutely an amazing piece of advice for our young people to understand. So thanks so much for sharing that. And also thank you so much for joining us today to have this case study discussion. I know that we've obviously just had this lockdown announced
Day one of lockdown.
WA. So thanks so much for joining us. As we're all transitioning to working back at home. So I really appreciate your time. That's fantastic. And everything you shared today has been so insightful, and it's going to be really useful. And it's so applicable to, not just the industry that you work in, but the concepts of safety and risk and the practices, and it's just fabulous. So thank you so much. I really value your input and insights.
Thank you, Karen. It's been a pleasure.